Let's get into some of the more common misinterpretations and misconceptions surrounding the PCA. Over the weekend, I watched a couple of videos that focused on the wording and the verbiage in the PCA, and I want to offer some potential other interpretations and correct some misinformation. And before I do, I come from TikTok, where people are very sensitive about having their misinformation corrected, at least publicly. And I need to make clear, I'm not doing this to be mean-spirited, to hurt anybody's feelings, to embarrass them. I'm doing it to either just offer another perspective or correct incorrect information. This case is just shrouded and buried in incorrect information, and I think it's important to correct it when we see it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play certain clips from these videos, stop them, and then I'll give my feedback. It's just easier to process that way. You'll be more likely to remember it. So I'll play the clips and then I'll give my feedback.
Recounts about how he's walking into the crime scene. So he talks about how he enters through the front door and he's directed to go upstairs. And this is where it all starts to unfold. So in the third paragraph, there's a part that says, as I approached the room, I could see a body, later identified as Kernodle's, laying on the floor. Kernodle was deceased with wounds which appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon.
All right. This one line, because it was mentioned in the same sort of paragraph as the bathroom, this is often misinterpreted because of the wording. He's saying as he approached the room, he was able to see Xana's body. The next line talks about Ethan and how there was a male also in the room. Now, the implication there is both Xana and Ethan were in the room. They were not half in and half out. They weren't in the hallway, because it does sound like he's saying, as I approached the room, I could see her body. And it does sound like, oh, she was in the hallway. You know, the what's explaining it and what's telling you, the detail that's missing is in the next sentence where it says also in the room. So as I described in a previous video, I believe Xana's body was at the foot of the bed, right in front of the door.
When he walks in the room and sees Xana's body, he can automatically tell that this crime has been committed with a sharp-edged blade. Now, it says also in the room was a male, later identified as Ethan Chapin. Now, Ethan Chapin's injuries are described as sharp force injuries.
Okay. As I mentioned in a previous video, I believe that Ethan was in bed at the time of the attack. Not just in bed, but probably under the covers. All four victims' wounds are described differently in this PCA. And I think the reason why Ethan's are described the way they're described is because he was probably clothed to some degree. His body was probably covered more. He was a guy, he was in a house full of women. You know, you get up in the middle of the night, you don't want to be walking around with no clothes on. So he probably had clothes on, and he probably was under the covers, and nobody can touch the body until, you know, certain walkthroughs are completed, until certain evidence has been taken. So the investigator is unable to pull the covers back, lift clothes up. They can only go on what they see. And that's why when they're on a crime scene, they're always sort of going from every angle. And that'll come into play in the next bit about the sheath. But his wounds probably weren't visible, and so they could only go on what they could see. So let's remember that. And the girls' wounds were probably more visible because they were probably wearing tank tops or nightgowns or something like that.
So he sees this immediately as he walks in the room. He can tell just by looking at the two victims exactly what their injuries were. Now, as he goes, as it reads through, he says, as I entered this bedroom, I could see two females in the single bed in the room. Now he's talking about he entered Xana's room first and saw Ethan and Xana. Then he goes upstairs and he's saying he can see two females both laying in a single bed. He says both Kaylee and Maddie were deceased with visible stab wounds. So he knows just by a visual check when he first walks in the room that these victims' lives were taken with a sharp-edged object. Now he also says, I also later noticed what appeared to be a tan leather knife sheath laying on the bed next to Maddie's right side when viewed from her bedroom door.
I think this is a case of him walking from the door to the back of the room and examining from a different angle. And that's what he meant by later. People are making a big deal of these qualifying words, or these buffer words, later, approximately. And it's so that they're intentionally not being specific, right? They're intentionally being vague. He probably walked around the crime scene and that's when he saw it. And it's very possible for an object to be underneath somebody and to their side if the body was on half of it and one half was visible and the other half was underneath the body.
So then he says that the Idaho State Lab later located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of the knife sheath. He doesn't mention anything else on this knife sheath. So this knife sheath is partially under Maddie's body. And there's no other DNA on this knife sheath. He doesn't mention that it's bloody. He doesn't.
Okay, and see, this is where the belief that things were cleaned up, things were cleaned. This is the root of it. The PCA is written first. You have to consider who's supposed to be reading this, and it's usually lawyers and law enforcement. So they're going to infer a lot of things. A lot of things don't have to be mentioned in the PCA because the person who's expected to be reading it will just understand. Number one. Number two, these PCAs are written with one goal in mind, and that is to gain an arrest warrant. And in order to do that, they have to focus on the information that supports their belief that a certain person is the subject. So they said that there was a single source male DNA on the button snap of the sheath. They don't mention the blood. They don't mention other DNA because it's not relevant to supporting the belief that Brian Kohberger was the subject. That stuff, it's not relevant. They're only going to include what supports their belief of who's the subject. They're not going to throw in a bunch of extraneous details because they don't need to.
Mention anything else other than that small source of DNA that is on the button snap. So there's nothing else on this knife sheath. It's almost like somebody wiped the knife sheath down and placed it on this bed.
See what I mean? That's where the idea that the scene was cleaned, that's where it's coming from. And there's no nuance to this discussion. And that is the biggest problem, is the lack of nuance. So when you hear something like that and you hear there was only one bit of DNA on the sheath, no, there was probably a lot more, but there was only one man's DNA on that sheath. And it was Brian Kohberger's, or at least that's who they're saying it was.
Basically, it's saying that Bethany and Dylan were inside the King Road residence at the time that the homicides occurred. Now he goes on to say, based on numerous interviews conducted by Moscow Police Department officers, state police, and FBI, he has learned the following. So he's stating that after these interviews, this is the conclusion that they have come up with after these interviews were conducted. So I'm going to skip through all the information about where all the roommates were earlier in the evening, because we've covered a lot of that. But I want to jump down to this part where it says Dylan and Bethany both made statements during interviews that indicated the occupants of the King Road residence were at home by 2 a.m. and asleep or at least in their rooms by approximately 4 a.m. So Dylan and Bethany both made statements that their roommates were home by 2 a.m. and that everyone in the house was asleep or at least in their rooms by 4 a.m. So this tells us that Dylan and Bethany were aware of what was going on in the house. Because how would Bethany know, being on the first level, how would Bethany know that all of the roommates were in their rooms or asleep by 4 a.m. if she's...
Okay. Now, when they say that they conducted interviews with Bethany and Dylan, those interviews were conducted separately. They wouldn't conduct the interviews with the two girls together because they, especially if they're trying to suss out whether or not they're involved. And so they need to see, do their stories match up? Do their stories contradict? What's going on here? So it doesn't necessarily mean that both Dylan and Bethany said that they each knew of the whereabouts of all four victims. What that means is once they compared the notes from each interview in totality, one probably knew where one set of victims were, and the other probably knew where the other set of victims were and when they got home. Not to mention who's above who, right? Because I believe Dylan was Dylan under, I'm not quite sure. We can do a layout video at another time, but based on what each one could hear, right? They can hear people above them. That's one way they can know where everybody was, right? So he's trying to make it seem like, well, how would they know that? How would Bethany on the first floor know what they were doing on the third floor? That's not what they're saying. They're likely saying that Dylan knew what Kaylee and Maddie were doing, and Bethany probably knew where Xana and Ethan were.
Dylan stated she originally went to sleep in her bedroom on the southeast side of the second floor. What does that mean? What does she mean that she originally went to sleep in her bedroom?
So I think this is somewhat straightforward. I think what this is implying is Dylan originally went to sleep on the second floor, but she ended up somewhere else. Now, we often hear people say, well, if they lied about where the roommates were, then police would lie about other things. Did they lie? Because if Dylan ended up going downstairs with Bethany, well, then they were asleep on the first floor, weren't they? You know, where she started and where she ended up, depending on where she was when the police came over, that's the information they're going to focus on, right? Like if she says, you know, I went to bed and then, you know, noise, I went downstairs to Bethany. So she started on the second floor and likely went down to the first floor. And that's where they fell asleep. So it's not that they lied about where they were sleeping. And also keep in mind, always look to see who's saying what. Is it the police that said they were asleep on the first floor, or was that a narrative that came about once the story started to unfold? Pay very close attention. Go back and watch those press conferences and watch what the police say and don't say. So it wasn't a lie that they were sleeping on the first floor. It sounds like they both were sleeping on the first floor after Dylan heard a lot of noise and she went downstairs.
To me, if she's saying I originally went to sleep in my bedroom, where did you end up? If you originally started off in your bedroom, where did you end up after that? If you were just originally went to sleep in your bedroom. Also, it says that Dylan stated that she was awoken at approximately 4 a.m. by what she stated sounded like Kaylee playing with her dog in one of the upstairs bedrooms, which were located on the 3rd floor. So now Dylan has been woken up. Dylan's asleep, apparently, and now she's been woken up by the sound of what sounds like Kaylee playing with her dog upstairs. Now, Dylan's bedroom door is closed. So she obviously heard this because it woke her up. So she hears Dylan, what sounds like Dylan, playing with her dog on the upper level.
Make special note of the fact that they don't explain what heard or thought she heard Kaylee playing with her dog actually meant. Did she hear the dog barking? Did she hear shuffling on the floor above her? What exactly did she hear that led her to believe Kaylee was playing with the dog? See, and this is what I mean when people say, well, there had to have been noise. There was noise. It just wasn't interpreted properly or correctly.
It says a short time later, Dylan said that she heard who she thought was Kaylee say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." Again, her door is closed and she hears Kaylee say what she believes to be, "There's someone here." So this tells us that Dylan can hear inside her bedroom. Dylan can hear inside her bedroom with the door closed. So she heard these two sounds, but she didn't hear Kaylee and Maddie fighting for their lives on the top level.
Now, here's what I believe, and I'm taking this as the two sort of clues from this the PCA. Later on, Dylan says that she opened her door because she thought she heard crying coming from Kernodle's room. Note that she doesn't say that she thought she heard Kernodle crying, number one. And number two, the fact that she thought she heard Kaylee say, "Someone's here," when investigators said it's very, very likely that it could have been Xana. See, what that tells me is Dylan didn't know if Xana was home or not. That's what that says to me. Because if she knew it was Xana crying, right, she would have said that she heard Xana crying. I don't think she believed or thought that the crying was Xana. She just knew it was coming from that direction, number one. And number two, no matter who said someone's here, right? We need to know, where were they standing, right? What was the inflection? How loud did they say it? So you can't just assume, well, if she heard that, then she must have heard what was going on in the bedroom. We need to know where the person who said it was in proximity to Dylan's room. You cannot make that leap without that information. That's a missing part of the variable there. And so you cannot make that assumption that if she could hear that, well, that means she could hear that.
Now, Dylan stated she opened her door a second time when she heard what she thought was crying coming from Xana's bedroom. Dylan then said that she heard a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you."
I want to stop there again, because notice how she's in her mind, she thinks it was Kaylee that said someone's here. She names that person, Kaylee. But when it comes to the crying and when it comes to the male voice, she's not able to discern whose voice it is. Or I should say who's like the crying. She's not able to discern it. She doesn't know who it is. And if she thought that the male voice was Ethan, she probably would have said Ethan. So she had no idea what was going on. Was this involving her roommates? Was some rando here? What's going on? That's my belief.
So when I read that sentence, it makes me think that what if the intruders were dressed like law enforcement?
Okay, this is just fucking stupid. I'm sorry. This is where I'm going to veer from I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but see, this is just irresponsible and it's reckless. As of right now, we don't know that there were multiple people. As of right now, we only know that there was one. And saying the intruders plural, you're leading people to believe something that we have no proof is true or not.
Because why would he be trying to reassure Xana that he can help her unless she believes that he's in a position to be able to help her?
I think that what he said, it's okay, I'm going to help you, or something to that effect. I think he said that to Xana to keep her quiet, to mobilize her so that she wouldn't shout, so that she wouldn't run, and so that he could get closer to her so that he could attack her. I think that was said to mobilize her, or excuse me, immobilize her.
Which, I'm not saying that these were law enforcement officers. I'm just saying, to me, that makes me believe that maybe these intruders were dressed as if they were in a position to be of assistance to Xana. I'm not saying that these were law enforcement officers. I'm just saying, to me, that makes me believe that maybe these intruders were dressed as if they were in a position to be of assistance to Xana. Now, at approximately 4:17 a.m., okay, this is important. At approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera located at 1112 King Road, which this house is basically right next door to the 1122 King Road house. So basically, this property is just 50 feet away from Xana's bedroom window. So this is basically a real close neighbor. So it says, at approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera located at 1112 King Road, a residence immediately to the northwest of the 1122 King Road house, picked up distorted audio of what sounded like voices or a whimper, followed by a loud thud. Now, it also says a dog can also be heard barking numerous times, starting at 4:17.
My belief is, first, the PCA isn't really written chronologically. So we're assuming that, we're trying to figure out the timeline of Dylan opening the door and what caused her, or what made her open the door. And the thing to be aware of is, we know why she opened it the first time. Someone's here. We know why she opened it the second time, because she thought she heard crying coming from Xana's room. But they never state why she opened the door the third time. It just says, after the crying, she opens the door, and which is referring to the second time she opened the door. So we don't know what was it that made her open the door for the third time. And I happen to think it was the thud and the dog barking. That or a text from downstairs. And I think it was the dog barking. You know, at that point with that thud, there was probably a struggle with Xana. That, or like I said, he came out from behind the door, he pushed her down. She's sort of stunned and looks up at him and says, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." And I'm not even sure if that follows the timeline of the PCA. I might be wrong on that. But I think that noise, I think that's what spooked him. Because when he took off, he didn't just remember what it says. He took off at a high rate of speed. Now, if I'm going to leave a scene like that, I'm going to do what I can to not draw attention to myself. He took off. Something spooked him. And I think it was the dog and the thud. And so when people say, well, why didn't he attack the other two roommates? Personally, I don't think he even saw Dylan. I don't even think he saw that the door was open. I think he left because the noise started and he didn't want to get caught. And that's why he took off. Because if you listen to that Linda Lane footage, you don't just hear him take off really fast. You can hear the screech of his tires.
Investigators thought that the murderer just left at that point. Now, the combination of Dylan's statements to law enforcement, review of forensic downloads of records from Bethany and Dylan's phone, and video of a suspect video as described below leads investigators to believe the homicides occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. Those times are important to remember. So they're saying that the homicides began at 4 a.m., they believe, and ended at 4:25 a.m.
No, they're not saying that. They're not saying that. That's how he's interpreting it. And this is one of the big misinterpretations. What is said is the homicides occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. Between. Not from 4 to 4:25, between those times. It's a window of time, and the homicides occurred within that window of time. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to do a part 2, but let me know what you think in the comments.